Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 63. Today's guest is Morgan DeLuna. Hey there, folks. So, just for context, as I'm recording this intro, it is the evening of Monday, April 9th, 2018, and it has been just a hell of a news day today, which, I feel like I've spent a good chunk of the last 16 months saying some variation of that. And the number of times that I've appended something like, I say that a lot, but this time really takes the cake. Well, I've said that a lot. I'm not going to go into the details of today's news. By the time it's far enough in the future that you don't just know, I figure by then either this will be some kind of a red letter date or else a new high bar will have been set for WTF just happened and the details won't matter anymore. I don't want to talk about the news. What I want to talk about is what the news does to, me, us, and what we do about the news. Something I've talked about before is how overwhelming things get sometimes and how it's okay to take time out and recharge. And I totally still believe that. I'm not going to lie. Before recording this, I spent a good 10 minutes or so sipping a glass of scotch and going down a rabbit hole of Star Trek The Next Generation minutia. And I do think that it's important to step back when you can and take care of yourself. But ultimately, I don't find that disengaging helps much in the long run, not for the world and not even really for my own mental health, because those problems are always still there when I come back. So what does help? On a day like today, which is to say most days, the news is mostly appalling and mostly stuff that I can't do anything about. So here's what I do. I find something I can do to help, and I do that. Maybe that's helping out with something big, like helping organize a voter registration drive in my neighborhood. Maybe it's something smaller, like supporting the canned food drive at my kids' elementary school. Maybe it's something just really little and personal, like saying something nice to a friend who's having a hard day. Just something. Something that tangibly makes the world even a tiny bit better, because there's always something that's in your power and within your means. And finding that thing, even just one little thing, it helps me feel like my day was worthwhile. So that's me. What about you? What helps you on a day like this one? Tweet at me at ChannelOpenPod. So, today's guest is photographer Morgan DeLuna. Morgan is a photographic artist based in Southern California whose work focuses on the relationship between appearance and identity, how we see and present ourselves, and how that is received by others. I got to meet Morgan and see her work through the Medium Festival of Photography here in San Diego last year. First, her Phenotype series, which is a series of self-portraits in which she alters her appearance with wigs, makeup, and some Photoshop to explore the connection between appearance, identity, and heritage. And then I also saw some work from her Extrospection series, which also uses self-portraiture, but in a very different mode. These are a series of abstract bodyscapes, looking at the topography of her own body as it is at the current moment as a sort of visual diary of her physical being. I put links to both of those series into the show notes, so if you can, take a minute, pause the show, and check those out right now. It'll add a lot of context for the conversation. Now, if you'd like to see some of Morgan's work in person, there are some upcoming opportunities. She has work in the Women Seen by Women group exhibition at Galeria Valid Foto in Barcelona from April 10th to the 28th, with an opening reception on April 12th at 7 p.m. And then here in San Diego, she has work in the About Face exhibition at the San Diego Art Institute. That show runs from April 21st to June 3rd with an opening reception April 21st from 6 to 8 p.m. And there are links to both of those in the show notes as well. Do check them out if you can. So let's get started. If you'd like to join in the conversation and live tweet the episode, you can use the hashtag ChannelOpenPod on Twitter. And now here's my conversation with Morgan DeLuna. Usually the first thing that I think about when I'm talking to somebody new is sort of where I first encountered their work. And I think so I met you at the Size Matters opening last year.
Right.
But actually the first time that I'd ever seen your work, I think, was when the Medium Festival announced your exhibition of Phenotype.
Right.
Which was at Subtext Gallery. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. And I thought it was a really interesting project. So I guess, like, if it's okay, can we start off with that body of work?
Yeah, absolutely.
So why don't I'll let you intro it.
Okay. So Phenotype, it's a series of self-portraits, kind of just reimagining how I could have looked if my genetic dice had been rolled differently. So, a lot of times I get asked, which one is this part of your heritage, which one's that? And the answer is they're all of them, because I'm all of them. It's just kind of looking at, what could I have looked like? I'm Jewish, I'm Lebanese, I'm Norwegian. So I have a brother who has blonde hair and blue eyes. And so it's kind of something that's been a theme for me most of my life, just looking at how we all look based on what's at play in there genetically. And it started off kind of just looking at that science of it. As I went on with it while making the work, it kind of evolved down a different path, that wasn't exactly comfortable, but I'm not very close with my family. So as I was doing this, I realized I started seeing different family members on my face, and that became quite uncomfortable. At times I wanted to stop. It was not enjoyable process anymore. And I figured that was probably just a good sign to keep going with it. Especially in the editing, there was like a particular image where I kept trying so hard to make it look a certain way, and it just looked more and more fake. And I realized it was because it looked a lot like my mother, and I just didn't want to see that face. And so I finally just had to say, okay, you know what? That's how it looks, because that's in me. And, I have to let the edit go that way. So it's kind of, part looking at science and then kind of part self-examination. So.
It's an interesting thing the thing you just said about, like, it was uncomfortable for you to be making the work at certain times. And I always find that such an interesting thing, like, to think about the sort of emotional process that we go through as the artist.
Right.
Oftentimes I find that with my own work, it's initially like there might be a thing that feels strange, but it's those sort of moments of confusion that lead to the moments of discovery.
Right.
And it's the sort of resistance to it that is sort of telling me that, well, I think there might be something important going on here.
Right.
So yeah.
And I don't know if, like me, you get an idea and you're excited by it, and then as you start working on it, it starts getting more emotional, and then the heavy stuff starts to come.
Yeah.
I don't know if that happens for you, but
well, the way that I work is a little different because I'm mostly I don't do a lot of stuff that's sort of in the studio, and so a lot of times for me it's more that I'm already taking pictures of just whatever I happen to naturally gravitate to.
Sure.
So I'm not necessarily starting from an idea.
Okay, right.
But then it's more just a question of sort of noticing, well, there seems to be a pattern here. What am I photographing? And then when I can sort of unpack why those things are things that I'm gravitating towards, then that's sort of where the discovery and then the emotions start
So you're working like
more.
outside in, where a lot of times I'm working inside out.
That's a really good way of putting it. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah. And I think that's maybe how in photography that kind of feels like those two categories.
Yeah. Yeah. I always find it really fascinating to see how different people work because I think that there's a real sort of diversity to approaches in photography,
Absolutely.
Which was surprising to me at first. So this work, it involves you, sort of through makeup and wigs and things like that, you're transforming yourself to looking phenotypically different. And there's an aspect to that, I mean, you probably hear this all the time, but like the first sort of reference that comes to mind for me is Cindy Sherman.
Yeah, I do get that.
But so like, I know, when I've read, Cindy Sherman talking about, old interviews or whatever about her work, that she'll sometimes sort of talk about this idea of like masks and characters and sort of what is and isn't real in the photograph. But your work feels sort of very different from that. Like it's superficially, it's kind of similar to Cindy Sherman's work because it's self-portraiture, but it feels like the aim is really different to me.
It is. And for my work, I mean, all of our work's personal, but mine, it comes from not fitting in. I was raised in Minnesota, and it's a lot of Scandinavian population or, you know, descendants there. So I always felt like I didn't quite fit in. And it was always those questions of, well, if I had blue eyes, if I had blonde hair, you know, would I still be bullied? Would I fit in better? You know, would I feel this way about myself? Like I have an early memory in, I think it was first grade, where they draw your silhouette and then you're supposed to cut it out like on black construction paper. And I remember looking at it and noticing like I had a bump on my nose and I was like, oh, the other kids don't have that. And I remember cutting it out. So I think it has to come from that struggle. I think the trying to reimagine one's identity, for me at least, that wanting to fit in and then getting there and not feeling like yourself. So then you don't fit in with yourself. So I think it's just kind of that struggle.
Yeah. That idea of not fitting in with yourself is something that, I don't know, I kind of wonder, because to me that sounds like that idea is something that sounds very familiar to me. And I always wonder if this is something that like everybody feels, or if it's really something more specifically tied to how people in this country experience race.
Right.
I'm sure there's other sort of vectors for that as well besides just race. But yeah, I don't know. There's something about that kind of unease that you can feel, or ways that you might want to. For me, it often expresses as sort of this desire to belong or be in a part of a community. That you know, there's this really sort of profound discomfort that can happen. And I feel like I see that, like in these photographs, I feel like there's like a persona being presented. And there's this sort of feeling of exploration, sort of like a what if kind of thing.
Correct. Yeah.
But there's also sort of like that feeling of sort of strangeness kind of also comes through. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And, you know, I experienced it, especially after I had done all the makeup and the shooting, getting to the editing portion. And it's very difficult because I'm looking at these photos and it's like, okay, what one is the best photo of this version of me, not the best image of me? And I had to start treating them as separate people in order to get the editing and to not see myself, because I kept trying to pull myself out of them, which it was kind of an interesting struggle. I think it was just you're used to your face. And so, yeah, there is an otherness, I think, for sure.
It's interesting because when I look at these photographs, one of the things that the sort of questions that I have, and I'm not sure it necessarily makes sense as an either or proposition, but whether it's more a matter of through these photographs finding difference or finding commonality, you know, like what, and by that, like, I guess the sort of the ultimate point being like the thing that you just said was that you had to treat the images as though they were of other people because you were pulling yourself out of them too much. And so the way that kind of suggests to me is it more like you're trying to highlight the differences and then sort of show that the differences, what am I trying to say? Individuality versus commonality, you know, or unity or universality. Does that make sense?
It does. I guess I didn't think about that before. That's an interesting point. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I was looking for like a freedom from who I see in the mirror every day. I look a lot like my father, which not thrilled about, but I'm used to seeing that face. And I think maybe there was a desire to see different faces. You know, there were a couple with the makeup. It had already changed me drastically. And it was odd looking in the mirror because you feel like you inside, but you're not seeing you on the outside. And it was was a bizarre feeling. Made me think about, people who have plastic surgery that maybe went wrong and they can't undo it. Because at first you feel free. You're like, oh, I don't look like me. Like all those things that you have tied to how you feel about yourself based on how you look kind of go away for a minute. And then all of a sudden you just feel really foreign. And then it's not fun.
Yeah. Sort of yourself as another.
Right.
It's sort of a strange thing. I think that a lot of people, certainly I know I've experienced this before, where you get this sense sometimes that you're alienated and you sort of wonder like how much of this is like being done to me and how much of it I'm doing to myself.
Sure.
But then in these photographs, you're sort of literalizing that.
Yeah. And it was an interesting, I guess I just didn't plan for what to come up. I feel like it was more like a social/science experiment to start with. And then you're working through it. And it's very interesting, how much we're tied to what we see in the mirror.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought, I wrote this down from your artist statement, one of the artist statements on your website, that you wrote that your work as a photographic artist focuses on the relationship between appearance and identity, how we see and present ourselves, and how that is received by others. And that was something that that was something that really resonated for me, because I think a lot of people have this sort of sense that identity is sort of wholly individualistic type of thing. And for me, there might be something inborn, but it's also very much informed by my experiences.
Right.
And that is very much driven by how people see me. And so, thinking about making photographic work that sort of explores that is interesting to me.
Yeah, I was really happy when I found photography. I started off in studio arts, and the medium was just it just wasn't giving to me what I needed with the ideas in my head. And so once I had discovered photography, I could start finally expressing some of these thoughts I had. I think, like you're saying about identity, what you're raised around too, I think really does affect that. Like I was raised around Jewish friends, so culturally I identify more with being Jewish. I wasn't raised religiously Jewish, but I culturally identify with that. And then also the Lebanese, my mom made Lebanese food. My grandpa had owned a Lebanese restaurant. And I do often wonder how I would feel connected to that if I didn't have the dark hair and the dark eyes. Would I still feel more connected to that, or would I feel more inclined towards my Norwegian heritage if I looked more that way? So, I don't really have the answers for those. It's just questions that arise.
Yeah, that is a question. It's on my mind a lot. Most recently, or most relevantly to sort of my current life, just because my kids, like my wife is white and I'm mostly not. I'm 3/4 Japanese and 1/4 white. And my kids are sort of, the way that they look is, I think that if you knew to look for it, you could see that they're part Asian. But I think a lot of people looking at them would just sort of see them as sort of racially ambiguous.
Okay.
And I wonder a lot, especially because for me, I'm very far removed from my immigrant ancestors. I'm 5 generations here. So culturally, I don't necessarily have quite the same level of connection that someone who has a closer tie to the immigrant generation would.
Right.
And I wonder how that's going to play out for my kids. My mom is half Japanese, and I remember talking to her about some of the ways that question of identity was sort of interesting for her, or difficult at times, because her mom, like for me, the long distance is 5 generations, but the short one is that my mom's mom. So my dad's family's been here a long time,
right,
but my mom's family, her mom was from Japan, and she always kind of wondered, like, does she feel more Japanese or something else? And also people, for some reason, seem to often think that she's Native American or Mexican. So that was also a whole other thing too.
Yeah, I got that as soon as I moved out here. People were just speaking Spanish to me constantly. I was getting yelled at for not knowing my language. And I'm like, I think anyone that's like not fair. I think in California, maybe they just assume are of Mexican descent.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting. I have friends of other backgrounds, you know, Mediterranean backgrounds, and they get the same.
Yeah. 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 It's I just remember this one Hawaiian stand-up comedian who was talking about how ever since he came to California, he gets to have the experience of being Mexican.
That's right. So how does your mom, does she feel like connected to her Japanese heritage, or does she feel pretty Americanized?
It's interesting, you know, because my mom, her mother was born and raised in Japan. Mm-hmm. And so that's a pretty close connection. Right. At the same time, that's pretty much her only connection to Japan, where like the extended family isn't like really, like they sort of grew up just sort of as a nuclear family and nothing else. Mm-hmm. So for me, like I know most of what I know about Japanese-ness comes from my dad's family, who are in a lot of ways a lot more Americanized than my mom's family. Sure. But I know my mom, I think it's sort of always been a question for her, you know? Mm-hmm. It's sort of a difficult thing, like if you don't know exactly where to locate yourself. Yeah. Yeah. It creates a sort of friction in your own sort of heart, I think. So was she, because I know this happens a lot of times with families that come here, they either still embrace their heritage and want to pass that along, or I think more often than not are like, and we're American now. Yeah. And they don't really pass that along. Did your mom, do you know if it was passed along to her, or was your grandmother like, okay, we're American now? I sort of get the impression that, my understanding is that of the sort of, war bride cohort of immigrants, that a lot of them felt a lot of pressure to assimilate very quickly. Sure. And I think also the fact that my grandfather didn't speak Japanese much, probably played into that as well. Right. Which is actually another, like the whole language thing is really interesting. My brother-in-law, so my wife's sister's husband, is Brazilian. Okay. And they just had their second baby. Their first son is 3. And it's one of these things where it's really important to him to sort of pass the language on and pass the culture along to his sons. But the baby is like 7 weeks old, so right. We're not there yet. But his older son is 3, and he's very resistant. Like he understands you when you speak Portuguese to him, but he won't speak it back. He just refuses. Oh, interesting. Yeah. He's already made some decisions. Yeah. Yeah. Huh. It's been a big topic of conversation what that sort of resistance is all about. I've been trying to learn a little bit of Portuguese so that he can have a little bit more, modeling, seeing adults talking to each other in that language. Right. And actually, my brother-in-law's parents have been visiting for several months, so that's been nice too. Yeah. So, anyway, I didn't really intend to talk so much about me. No, that's fine. I find it interesting. That's part of what my work, it's like, I'm expressing something in myself, but, hopefully these are things that other people, I don't know, I like talking about these things. Yeah. It's interesting for me, and I don't know, I sometimes feel very isolated of this otherness of, I'm always asked, well, what are you? Or there's something going on in there. Like what's, yeah. And so you kind of can't avoid thinking about it when you're asked that so often. Yeah. Frequently. Yeah. That question, the what are you question, is such an interesting question to me. Because, and like sort of the range of reactions that I hear from people who talk about that question, who get it a lot, like we're all used to getting that question, right? Right. We're not, maybe not all of us, but certainly most of the non-white of us are used to that question. And I know a lot of people have a real, like one thing that I've heard some of my friends talk about is how that question is really sort of about white people needing to have some form of control over you to be able to, because they need to be able to put you in a nice little box so that they can understand you. Interesting. But what that never quite gets to for me is how, like, I kind of need that too. You know, like
Right.
it would be a lot easier for me if I could answer that question easily.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Now, do you get offended when you're asked that? I tend to not be offended because I'm so used to hearing it. Do you? Because I've heard some people really are offended by that question.
I know a lot of people personally who are very offended by that question. Mm-hmm. I don't think offended is the right word for me.
Okay.
But one thing that it often does make me feel is a little isolated.
Right.
So there's a discomfort with it, but it's not necessarily that I'm angry about it. You know?
Does it matter to you, or I guess does the feeling change depending on who's asking it? If it's someone Caucasian versus somebody else who's obviously of color?
I'm not sure it does. I'm not sure. I don't actually get that question that much from people of color. Most commonly, I feel like when it's another Asian person talking to me, mm-hmm. they can usually tell from my name that,
right.
that I'm Japanese. Mm-hmm. And like other non-Asian people of color don't seem to ask.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. But like, what's your experience with that question?
You know, I've been asked it so much that it doesn't really faze me. More of anything, I'm like, well, what are you? Because I'm interested. I'm really interested in DNA and genetics and all of that. So I don't know if it's really. I don't know. I'd have to think back really, really far because I remember being asked that ever since I was really young, like elementary school. Mm-hmm. And my earliest memories with that question is just being confused. Because I remember like going to the store and I'd look at the Barbies and I was like, as a little girl, you want to pick one that looks like you. Well, obviously I wasn't like blonde hair, blue-eyed Barbie, but then the white, brown-haired Barbie didn't quite feel right either. And so I'd usually either pick African-American dolls or Asian dolls because that felt more right for me. Like most of my dolls were not white. So yeah, I don't know. I think maybe it's just that question for me is like, I don't know. I guess how do I identify? It's hard when you have so many different things in you too. It's like, well, I can't really choose because they all kind of make me up. You know, I'm kind of comprised of all of these things. So
yeah. And that's an interesting thing too, because it, like for me, like the way that I look is one thing. Mm-hmm. People from Japan can usually tell that I'm not completely Asian, but everybody else mostly just seems to assume that I am. Mm-hmm. But like on some level, because I have that one white grandparent, I would feel like that part of my heritage should be as equally accessible to me as the Japanese side of it.
Right.
And yet a lot of times it feels like people don't want me to have that access to it, like that.
That's interesting.
That I kind of am expected to sort of not be connected to that as much, which on a lot of levels is weird.
Yeah. You know what though, as you're saying that, I get what you're saying because it's like, well, you look like a person of color. You should be connected to that part of your heritage.
Yeah.
Like I really growing up loved like Norwegian folk stories and I liked all of that even though, and it's part of my heritage, but yeah, sometimes you feel like if you embrace that, then you're being disrespectful to the other heritages.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's interesting. I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to talk about more than just one of your bodies of work. And because the other one that the one that you had a picture in the Size Matters exhibition was from, it's called Extrospection.
Yes.
Yeah. And so these are a series of sort of abstracted bodyscapes, I guess.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no. Yeah. So it was, I actually wasn't planning on shooting this work. I'm like 36 now and things are starting to change on my body. I had an injury, to my back a few years ago, so I can't be in shape as much as, I would have liked. I can't push it as hard. And I'd had a really stressful year and my body just wasn't feeling great. And I was like, I was looking at how the light was hitting my skin and my body. And I was like, what if instead of just like really hating on my body, I just kind of started embracing it as a landscape and just looking at the form and appreciating, I don't know, how it moves and how the lines are instead of, getting in my head about, oh, I'm not like how I used to be or, my body isn't like what it was when I was in my 20s. Because in like figure drawing, figure painting, you don't want a thin or like muscular model. You want that round, voluptuous. So I was kind of treating it with that in mind of just looking at the curves and the lights and, just looking at them as like little individual pieces and moments. And like you said, like treating them like landscapes.
Yeah. One of the things that you mentioned in the artist statement, and that certainly was sort of one of the things that, I mean, aside from just sort of the sort of abstracted aesthetics of it, which the photographs are very beautiful.
Thank you.
But one of the things that really sort of attracted me to these photographs was that in the artist statement you talk about, that it's specifically at this place and time in your life, the freckles that will surely darken, the skin that will grow more translucent over time, the scars that exist and the ones yet to come, and that you called it a diary of your current physical being. And in particular with the scars, because there are several of the images, not all of them, but several of them will have, like, you can see a little, like, whether it's a scar or maybe even just a very recent scrape, just a line on the skin, that what I thought was so interesting is this idea that your skin is a record in some way. But that also because that is one of the primary ways that people engage with photography as a medium is as a record. And so that you had those two things intersecting in the image, I just thought that was fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. As you look at your body, you just kind of realize it's going to keep changing. If we're lucky and we're here long enough, it's going to change quite a lot. So I thought maybe this would be a more interesting approach to aging, just kind of taking a break from working with inside my mind and just kind of looking at the outside. I mean, it's still kind of informed from how I'm thinking about myself or feeling about myself, but going in a more positive direction of, this will be interesting. What's different on my body this year or a couple of years from now? Realizing that sunspots are going to get darker and my veins are going to be, more predominant as we age. You think of like your grandmother's hands, how paper thin and interesting those were.
Yeah. So do you view this work as sort of an ongoing thing?
I'm not sure if it's going to be yearly or, every few years, but I do see myself continuing with this work. So
I was going to say I always get a little nervous around, like references because I on some level, I kind of feel like references can sort of devalue the work that is like the newer work,
right.
And I don't mean to do that at all. One of the things that came to mind when I was thinking about this is sort of thinking about other photographers who have sort of worked in the space of bodies and abstraction. The two that came to mind immediately for me were Edward Weston and Harry Callahan.
Oh, I love both of their work.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's in there. You know, we get these images in our brain and.
Well, and I mean, I think their work is also amazing and very beautiful. But the really obvious and immediate difference between this series and their work is that, you're taking pictures of yourself. And so that inherently makes it like a very different proposition in terms of like what's expressed and in terms of who owns the gaze of the camera. And I just thought that was really interesting to sort of, see these images as both, a very personal expression, but also sort of in conversation with earlier work.
Sure. I'm sure that, as artists, we look at art. And so I think something that, makes our brain light up when we see it sticks in there. So when we're on the other side of the camera ourselves, like with that, I could see what I was shooting. I have a camera where I can flip the screen. So I could see exactly, my compositions when I was setting it. So I'm sure that, either on some subconscious level, it was being informed that way. But, I just, I don't, I don't know.
All right. We should probably take a little break and then we come back and do the second segment.
Sounds good.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which can be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever's on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Well, I thought about two things, and I guess they actually intersect with each other. One just being social media. Like, is it good? Is it bad? How do we feel about it? And then also just what really defines a photographer and photography. And I think that those things actually overlap now with where we're at with technology and the fact that everyone is walking around with a camera.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I find it interesting. I was looking at your work, and when I look at your images, I can tell, I don't know how this permeates the surface, but you can feel that you're being thoughtful and that the moments that you're capturing are meaningful to you. I think a lot of times on social media, you can see images and we consume so many images, but a lot of times they feel vapid. And I don't really know how we can sense if they do or don't, or maybe if you can sense that in an image, if it has heart or if it's just...
I think part of it for me, when I'm looking at images online, has a lot to do with how they're presented.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if I'm on Instagram or Facebook or something and I see somebody's pictures and I know that they're an artist, for example, or whatever, or even maybe just how they're captioned, definitely plays a lot into how I would receive those images. I don't know. I think there's something that I know a lot of people, and this isn't even a new thing. I was just actually I just finished the other day reading this Susan Sontag's On Photography.
Oh, okay.
And this was back in the 70s, and she was talking about vernacular photographs. So I know it's not brand new, but I feel like maybe it's just my awareness of what people are talking about has changed. But I think there can be interesting things about vernacular photographs, but most of the time what really comes across with them is that they're very much just like everybody else's pictures.
Yes.
You know?
Yes. Yeah. I'm still like, I don't know. I'm kind of at that, not technically a millennial, but what do they have a new term for now? It's like Zennials.
Yeah.
Where it's like, well, I mean, Atari did not exist when I was, just first here on this planet. So, I still remember writing papers on a word processor and a typewriter and having to look up every word I didn't know how to spell with a dictionary, and then all of this evolving. I didn't have a cell phone, I think, until I was in my early 20s. So I don't really know how I feel about social media. I'm curious to hear, like, if you think, do you think it's, there's pros, cons? Is it good and bad?
Just to start with, you and I are pretty close to the same age. From your bio, you put, you're born in 81.
Yeah.
And I was born in 79. So we're basically
super close. Yeah.
I don't know. I also always kind of find all the talking about generations to be a little, sometimes useful and sometimes really like, I don't know, but yeah. But yeah, that sort of in-betweenness. I also think about that in-betweenness sort of, that's just one more way that I always sort of feel like I don't belong in one.
Right. Right. I know.
I don't know. Social media, my relationship to social media is possibly a little bit different from other people who are sort of close to our age or older, in that I've been sort of engaging with online friendships and relationships for a lot longer than social media has, what we call social media now has existed.
Okay.
So like for me, even going back to like middle school, I spent a lot of time back then on like local dial-up bulletin boards.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
And then moving into, during college, I had other things to occupy my time, when you're just living with your friends 24 hours a day. But then afterwards, I spent a lot of time on web forums, and I actually run a web forum on my own website, and that's been there for 15 years now.
Okay.
So I think my understanding of, or my feelings about social media are very sort of inflected by that experience.
Absolutely.
And for me, I know that I have made a lot of very close friends through some of whom I've still never met in person.
Oh, interesting.
And it's also been times where things can get very toxic very quickly, even when you're around people that mostly have good intentions. And I think that like the way that social media sort of replicates that. It does the same thing, but it just does it faster because everything is a little bit more bite-sized.
Right.
But what's like sort of your experience with social media?
You know, I use it and I kind of have like a love-hate relationship with it. It's been a way for me to meet people before actually meeting them in person.
Mm-hmm.
And in that way, it's been really nice. I'm kind of an introvert anyway, so I'm not necessarily always looking there to interact with people. I'm kind of happy in my own little world sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I find it stressful, actually. I'm not used to having people have access to me so many ways. Instant messenger or Instagram messenger, emails, texts. And I have this, I'm sure this is my problem, but I feel like, oh, I need to respond to them because they just messaged me.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's a bit overwhelming. I don't know if I'm just old fashioned. I like things quiet and slow. So yeah, it's kind of, I don't know. I don't think I know how I feel about it yet. You know, I definitely use it. I'm curious. I have, on Instagram, I have a private account and then I have like a public account because everyone's like, well, you need a public account. Mm-hmm. And then I made a third account for a project I'm working on.
Right. The Instagrids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just kind of looking at that culture of persona. And I don't know. It's interesting because you've been using it, you know, as a social like field for quite a while. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that you have good like boundaries with the people that you communicate with that way? Because I feel like, I don't know, to me, when I look at social media, it's just like, it feels like a free for all. Like people say what they want, they do what they want. It doesn't matter if they're representing themselves as they actually are. They're comfortable being an avatar of themselves.
I would say that probably right now I'm better at having boundaries, like sort of clear boundaries online, but that's not necessarily, that is the result of a lot of therapy.
Yeah.
And that wasn't necessarily just online either. It was sort of, you know, having boundaries just in any relationship.
Absolutely.
I do think, you know, it's sort of interesting to think about how, you know, whatever lack of boundaries I might have had before going through this sort of therapeutic process, how much that was informed or influenced by online culture. Because I do kind of get this sense that when I look at people who are more than about 5 or 6 years younger than me, which is just going back to that, you know, exennial thing, that like people who are 5 or 6 years older than me seem to be sort of more generally one way or the other, like in this particular way. And people like 5 or 6 younger than me feel a certain way. But then like that sort of 10, 12 year span in between, we're just kind of like, I don't know.
Yeah.
But that like I look at people who are sort of the age of some of my youngest cousins or something like that, that there doesn't seem to be on average quite the same sense that things ought to be private. You know?
Oh, interesting.
Or that like that boundaries are I feel like for them are more a question of like, what am I willing to take in rather than what am I willing to put out?
Oh, that's interesting.
And I'm sure that like somebody is going to at me and be like, yeah, you know, but, you know, that's just sort of what my observation has been.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I don't even know if there is a right or wrong answer. I think it's just, I think maybe personal perception. We're all so different, even though we're all the same. I find like there's people that I like more on social media than I actually like in person, and sometimes vice versa. And I mean, I guess it's a totally different way of communicating. You're having more time to be thoughtful about what you're saying, and you know, you can delete things and re-edit until it sounds just right. Whereas in person, you know, it's whatever comes out of your mouth comes out of your mouth.
Yeah.
You know? So
I'm much better in text than I am in person.
Oh, me too. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, it is. Although, you know, then I feel like on some, like, at least maybe more on Twitter than on Facebook, but there is this sort of attitude of being unfiltered, being sort of a virtue and being sort of unedited, which I think is just another sort of persona, but it is sort of interesting. Like what kinds, I think that's like the real question for me is with social media is like what by sort of virtue of the medium itself, what behaviors are sort of incentivized and rewarded and which ones are sort of penalized.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because I think on some level, all of us, like we all talk about like, oh, I don't need to feel cool or whatever, but like everybody has a desire, like a drive to belong and
Absolutely.
be accepted.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I think it operates on a level that we're not necessarily thinking about consciously.
Sure. I mean, you think about us just from like a sociological or is that sociological, anthropological perspective, you know, it's not good to be kicked out of the group.
Yeah.
You know, you get kicked out of the group, you don't survive.
Yeah.
So that's got to be wired in there still.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So with all of that, I'm curious to see what you think. I've noticed like a lot of the younger group, I would say probably mid-20s to earlier. Well, from the people that I've met, sometimes I feel like there's this desire to be famous via social media and then a frustration when things aren't happening in real life for them. And I don't know. I don't really know what social media, being raised on social media, how that's changed people, if it's made them more open-minded to people and differences, or if it's made them kind of confused about where they are in the physical world versus their life in the virtual world.
Yeah. I guess it's a good question. I don't know. I don't think that, or at least my experience of most social media is not that people are generally super accepting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know. There's a lot of people being really shitty about a lot of really shitty things.
Yeah. I know. I think about how bullying, you know, when we were kids, it's like, it sucked, but you went home, it didn't follow you.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. I just kind of constantly think about what this younger generation must be experiencing. It's so hard to relate.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like, at least like with our parents' generation, I mean, things were more or less the same. You know, you used the white pages and the yellow pages to figure stuff out. And, you know, what happened in one place was there and then you still had home, or, you know, I don't know. I feel like it's like a never ending. There's no separation in their life. And I could be totally wrong. I don't know. You know, I'm not being raised that way, but.
Yeah. Well, maybe one sort of thing that might be interesting here is like, do you feel like your interactions with, you know, people in general, or like the way that you perceive other people or yourself or whatever has changed as you do or don't interact with social media?
You know, it's interesting. I do have a few friends that do not participate like online at all. They don't have a website. They're artists, but they don't have a website. They don't do social media. And I feel bad saying that you sometimes forget that you have friends that aren't getting their information that way. I do notice when I spend time with those people, I feel like more grounded. Things are slower paced, like just like real genuine conversation, because their minds aren't flooded with, you know, any of that stuff that's happening, you know, in social media. But, you know, on the flip side, yeah, I do feel bad that sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, I totally forgot to tell this person about X, Y, and Z, because you just kind of assume, oh, someone saw this on social media. I've now told everyone, and you know, sometimes you haven't. So it's an interesting choice, I think, that some people make.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of them, I have a friend, she's tried it. She said it was just too stressful for her. And there was just so much garbage, you know, going on that she stepped away, and she's like, you know what? I'm okay if I miss stuff. And you know, that's interesting to me, because I think there is a panic of, well, I don't want to be out of the loop. So I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah. What I often think of is, that for me, and I think the way that I see a lot of people interacting with it is, there is an aspect of being in the know or up to date on things. That's one part of it. But another thing that I think of is that, I mean, like the biggest sort of cliche complaint about Instagram in particular is like, why is everybody sharing their lunch? Right.
Right.
And I feel like there's something interesting about that interaction where, because being to the point where you can have the kind of a relationship with people who are physically separated from you, where you can be like, I'm sharing things with you. And that can be a very powerful thing. Like, you know, if I just want to tell somebody how my day is doing, and I might not necessarily have somebody that I can talk to about that stuff in person, being able to have, I don't know, for lack of a better word, an audience.
Yeah.
That provides an interesting sort of venue to be seen in a certain way. But then it also, I feel like the flip side of it is that it also comes with a certain pressure that you feel to perform. And that is sort of like the sort of two edges of it that I'm never quite sure about, you know?
Yeah, that balancing act.
I mean, for me, in my photographic work and in my writing, in a lot of ways, the whole point of it, of any of it, is to be seen. Like, is to have someone see this and be able to know something about me.
Right.
And it seems like that there's that in your work as well.
Yeah, to share and to be a part of the human race, like to interact with each other. So with that about social media, how do you feel, I don't know, how do I say, what has it done to or for photography? We see so many images, especially on Instagram. And I know there's kind of an argument of, has it hurt the field of photography? Has it helped it? I mean, I do see like there are younger people now. I know that the arts are not as much in the schools as they should be. And they're finding this as an outlet to express themselves, which I think is wonderful. But at what point is it just that obligation to, oh, I didn't post today, versus genuinely wanting to post something?
Yeah.
And I don't know what does that do to photography as an art?
Yeah. One of the things that Sontag book that I just read was, I at times found it a little infuriating, but she had so many amazingly insightful things to say. One of the things that I thought was the most interesting thing in there was when she, like on some level, I feel like at this point we're like more than 100 years into the history of photography. Like the question of whether photography is an art form is kind of boring at this point. But the thing that she said about this is that photography is not an art form, that photography is not an art form for the same reasons that language, it's not an art form, but rather it is a tool that we can use to create art. But it can also do other things, like with language and writing are not art forms in themselves, because you can use language and writing to, you know, write a sonnet or a novel, but you can also use it to write a grocery list. And so nobody would argue that a grocery list is art unless it was for some reason presented in that way. But, and for the same reason, like photography, you can use it to make art, but there are other things about it that we can use that aren't art, which I feel like is sort of not exactly what you were just asking.
No, but it's still an interesting point. And it kind of goes to the other thing of what is photography? What is a photographer?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
'Cause when you say I'm a photographer, people are like, they have their assumptions right away of what that means. But I think it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people using the medium.
So I think like what I was getting from, you know, as I think about it, instead of just sort of vomiting, here's something I read, at you. The question that I hear from you is, if you are a practicing artist, then having this new venue, how does that change how you interact with your own artwork? Is that sort of
more of like, does it I don't want to say devalue photography. It's just, we're consuming so many images, and I don't know if that, for people who are not in the field of art, maybe people who just enjoy looking at art or just enjoy looking at photos, I don't know, what does that mean for photography? We don't have millions of drawings flooding our eyes every day, but we do have photographs.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what you're saying, in the book, it makes a good point about the fact that it isn't just, it's just one way that you're using to express it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. As art. I mean, there's ways to inform. Like, I don't want to forget I parked right here. I'm taking a picture of this spot. I'm not making art. I'm making,
mm-hmm.
a document so that I'm not wandering the parking lot for an hour.
Yeah. Well, do you feel like, because we can't, like the image thing is, you can't escape it. It's everywhere.
Right.
So even if you're not on your phone,
mm-hmm.
right? Like even if you're not on the internet somehow, there's still just images everywhere.
Absolutely.
Do you feel like that has an effect on your appreciation for it? Like, does it, because I could see in some ways you might argue like it would make any particular image seem less impactful, but I could also see where it might do the opposite.
I think for me, context is super important. Mm-hmm. And, I enjoy looking at a beautiful image as much as anyone, but I think sometimes I think in pictures.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a visual thinker. So for me, there's already just a massive amount of pictures going on in my head constantly. So seeing billboards and, magazines in the grocery store, it sometimes is a bit too much. So for me, when I go to a gallery or a museum and I see photographic work, my first thing is I want to know the context of it and what it means. I remember it was a few years ago at MoPA, they had a work by Matthew Brandt. And I don't know if you know his work.
A little bit, yeah.
And at first I saw this huge
I think he actually
print.
just came out with a new book.
I think you're right. I think he did. Yeah, it was this huge print. It was this work he was doing on film. He was taking pictures of lakes and then letting the print, after he developed it, soak in the water from that lake. And kind of it would destroy it a little bit. But at first I saw it and I'm like, okay, someone did Photoshop again. And then I went over and I read it and I was like, oh, that's really actually kind of beautiful and poetic that, here you're letting it decompose in the water of, that you photographed. And for me, then all of a sudden it meant a lot more. Mm-hmm. So I think when I'm looking to appreciate it as an art, I really am looking for something deeper than just the image.
Yeah. Same.
Yeah. Right. So, but sometimes it can be overwhelming for me to walk in and like, I love photography. I work in photography, but sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, more images. My brain just can't handle it. And like I said, it's different for me. I think in pictures. When I'm trying to remember something, I'm Rolodexing through images in my head to get that information. So it might be different for me than versus someone who is more like oral and they are used to just like processing information by what they hear or so.
Yeah. This is actually super interesting and I want to continue it, but we're getting pretty close to time. Okay. And there's always one question that I like to ask everybody before we close. And that is, if there is a piece of art or literature or just general creativity that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Actually, I went to a lecture at the San Diego Museum of Art about beauty and ugliness in art. And it was just really interesting listening. They were talking about how even if something's not a beautiful subject, what it has to say can be the beauty in it. It can be beautiful because it's done, with technical mastery. And what it's saying, like some of Frida Kahlo's work, it's not beautiful. It is because of how she paints it. But some of the things that are in those paintings are quite graphic and looking at the pain in her life, seeing organs and things are not necessarily beautiful things that we want to look at, but what she's expressing is the beauty. And I don't know, I found that really an interesting topic.
Yeah. It's certainly one that's very relevant to photography.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I always like the big jump, I think certainly for me, was getting to the point where I'm showing pictures to people and they're like,
why don't you take a picture of that? That's just a can, or that's just a, like it's just some old paint or something on the wall. Like, who cares? But there's a way that by taking it and presenting it, it can be elevated. Yeah.
Yeah. And we feel something. And I think maybe, I don't know, with you as a photographer as well, sometimes we see something, we feel it, and it's very hard to make an image of it that is expressing a feeling that we have about it. If you take it just at the wrong angle, it just doesn't, you're like, no, that's not what I'm experiencing here.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah. I always say photography is really easy and photography is really hard.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time talking with me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so once again, Morgan has work in the Women Seen by Women exhibition in Barcelona, April 10th to the 28th, and in the About Face exhibition in San Diego from April 21st to June 3rd. Check out the links in the show notes for all the details and see those shows if you can. And that is our show. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find all of the show's contact and social media info in the show notes. If you'd like to support the show, a monthly pledge in any amount to our Patreon campaign is greatly appreciated. You can find that at patreon.com/sakeriver. That's sake like the drink and river like river. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. We'll be back on April 25th with a conversation with artist Andy Burgess, so be sure to come back for that one. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.